Hey everyone, welcome. This is the session on increasing the accountability of ICANN, and the Twitter handle for that is hashtag IGFUSA ICANN. And we've got a super panel here put together, and I think we're going to be able to read out some interesting insights, questions, and uh, discussions that we'll be able to take to the IGF in Istanbul. My name's Steve Del Bianco. I'm Executive Director of NetChoice, which is a coalition of e-commerce companies and online businesses around the world. Our main mission is to keep the internet safe for capitalism. So we're awfully busy in state capitals here in Washington, but especially for the last 8 years at ICANN and the Internet Governance Forum. While folks are coming in, I'll quickly run through intro of our panelists today. Their bios are in the handouts, but I can't resist saying a few key things about the folks who've joined us. On the far end of the table is Fiona Alexander, and Fiona is an absolute net energy source at the U.S. Commerce Department, where she handles the ICANN portfolio and led the drafting on the 2009 Affirmation of Commitments, a superb document. And Fiona writes most of Larry Strickling's talking points on IGF and ICANN. Larry tends to speak his own mind, doesn't he? And Fiona is also on point for the latest drama, which is the NTIA transition of IANA. And then we have Jamie Hedlund, who leads ICANN's Government Affairs Department for all of North America. With all that's happening in ICANN, including the new GTLD program, the Commerce Department, what's happening in Congress, Jamie could be the most harried panelist here today, but he never lets it show. Then we have Matthew Shears, and he leads the Global Internet Policy Project at Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT. And he represented CDT at the IEF, Net Mundial, and other global proceedings. He's worked for AT&T, satellite startups. And Matthew's a UK national, which you'll notice as soon as he gets a chance to go on mic, but he got his BA right here from GWU. And Becky Burr. Becky is the panelist in this room who's probably most able to claim, I was there at the creation.
It's all my fault.
And Marilyn Cade is right beside you. And because Becky was the NTIA administrator when the white paper came out, when we created ICANN in the first place. So we blame her or beatify her for our current situation. Becky's now with Newstar and the registry behind .us, .biz, and Becky, I think, over 300 new top-level domains as well. All right, so how did we get here? I'll do a short bit of setup. We have 5 structured questions for the panelists. They'll each give short answers to those, 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for audience interaction. So how did we get here to where we're asking the question, how to increase the accountability of ICANN? A quick recap, in '98, the Clinton administration and Becky privatized and internationalized management of the domain name system and the coordination of names and numbers. They created ICANN. And I put a little chart up there for you to sort of put ICANN within the context of all of the different entities who are seeking to hold ICANN accountable. And ICANN in the middle of there is a bright golden yellow, sort of like a hot ball of plasma suspended between magnets that want to draw it towards them. And that's pretty much what we've been dealing with for the last several years. A few things have changed in the diagram. For instance, in 2009, the US government transitioned ICANN from direct oversight to something much more independent. That's the affirmation of commitments. So there's still a connection line between the Commerce Department and ICANN on the affirmation of commitments. But that affirmation is cancelable by either party and isn't seen as a permanent form of accountability. There's also a line from Commerce Department to ICANN for the IANA functions. And we show the IANA functions as living there within ICANN because it's something that they are fulfilling today pursuant to the contract. Well, this year, you've heard many times today that the U.S. announced it would let go of its IANA contract authority when that contract expires next September of 2015. And as Secretary Strickling said today, that could be extended for any amount of time unilaterally by the government if more time were needed. Secretary Strickling also today laid out the fact that the transition really has 2 parts. The first is this transition of the IANA functions so that that contract can go away. And the second was what Larry called the overall accountability of ICANN. And as he said, to fill the gap left by the U.S. letting go of the authority it has under the IANA contract. And then finally, Congressman Greg Walden suggested that it was so important to get the accountability part right before the IANA transition occurred. So our panel, that's where we are. And let's figure out with the help of our panel, where we're going to go from here. So the first question, and we'll go down the line. Each of you take 1 to 2 minutes on it. The IGF has talked about accountability at ICANN for 7 years under the theme of critical internet resources and enhanced cooperation, something else that they brought our way. So now Net Mundial has occurred, and the IANA contract announcement have pushed the ICANN accountability into sharper focus this year, sharper than ever. So looking ahead to Istanbul, many have said Net Mundial was successful. Well, what's your view on how Net Mundial is going to change the conversation this year on ICANN accountability? Did we set unrealistic expectations? And how will Net Mundial play into that? We'll start with you, Becky.
So I have to correct one thing. The United States government did not create ICANN. The global internet community created ICANN, and we recognized it. That's very important, and I think Fiona will echo my thoughts in it, that that's why the transition is continuing on in the road that we started off, although quite a long while ago. I actually think that Net Mundial advanced the ball quite a lot on ICANN accountability, because we have been talking for years about transparency, reconsideration, transparency. Net Mundial said accountability means redress for people, organizations that are affected by actions or omissions of ICANN. And to me, this is, forgive the non-Americans in the audience, but it's like the Wizard of Oz saying to the Tin Man, you know, you say you don't have a heart. What you need is this clock. Well, what we need is an independent judiciary. That's what we need. And it's fairly, I think, Net Mundial, the language, sort of served that up to us in an important way.
Yes, thanks, Steve and Becky. Let me just perhaps step just a little bit back from Net Mundial. I think I would absolutely agree that Net Mundial moved the ball forward, but it moved the ball forward not just in terms of the IANA situation, but also in terms of multi-stakeholderism, the principles that underpin it, the way it characterizes multi-stakeholderism, which are good signposts for us in terms of how we evaluate multi-stakeholderism at play, whether it's in ICANN or whatever other structure it might be. So that's certainly helpful. The other thing that Net Mundial did was it advanced the notion that very clearly, explicitly asked for the IANA transition to take place within and outside of the ICANN community. And that is something that we need to pay attention to as we go forward. Obviously, it's still very early days. The coordinating group will be meeting over the next 2 days to establish what the scope of its work is, etc. But ensuring that those who are outside of the internet community networks and platforms and outside of the ICANN communities have a voice will be an essential element that Net Mundial is seeking, and we should pay a lot of attention to going forward.
Jamie.
Sure. So in addition to some of the text of the Net Mundial document that touches on in important ways on accountability, I think there are other aspects of Net Mundial that should inform, and hopefully will inform, the processes for both the transition and enhancing accountability. Those are, there's a tremendous amount of diversity participating in Net Mundial. There was a tremendous amount of opportunities to participate both in person as well as remotely. And I think my sense is to get the transition right and to get accountability right for ICANN, that those things are critical. So I think there are great lessons from it there. I think there's also, the document itself has terrific things to say about accountability as a value. And accountability has to infuse both processes. It doesn't provide a whole lot of very specific guidance on enhancing accountability, but Net Mundial wasn't supposed to do that. It wasn't supposed to get deep into specific issues. So I agree that there's a lot that the Net Mundial experience and the document have to offer.
Fiona.
See, being the last person, I guess I agree with most people. I think, in particular, Matthew and Jamie sort of highlighted what I would sort of point to as the real takeaways on this topic, which is there's a lot of expectations now, and I would think that they're ones that the internet community can meet. But there's a lot of awareness, and there's going to be a lot of people that want to participate that haven't. And I think NetMundial and the way that it was run, if you didn't go to the meeting, in terms of the 4 microphone lines, but also people beaming in from around the world and the openness and being able to participate from wherever you were in the world, I think could be setting sort of an interesting precedent for how people expect meetings to work in the future in terms of being open and accessible to people. And I think that'll be an interesting challenge for the coordination committee that's meeting tomorrow and Friday in London, and then also the tech of the accountability process as it moves forward. And I think that may be one of the biggest takeaways, which is all the people and a lot of people in this room, and there's a lot of new folks as well, which is great, but a lot of people in this room have spent 15 plus years working on this. There's a lot of other people that are now showing up and want to participate. And I think that's going to be an interesting system to work through to get everyone involved and engaged.
Fiona, both you and Jamie pointed up that notion of an opportunity to participate. And I was struck at NetMundial that having 4 lines, explicit lines for government, business, technical community, and civil society, meant that you knew where to go, you knew when to stand up, and a similar theme was coming out of each line, and that does seem appealing because it's a more accessible way to figure out where do I fit into this debate, and who knows, maybe it's something that could be imported into some of what we do at IGF or even ITU. Um, and Becky mentioned that redress is explicitly listed in the NetMundial document, and that's a really important element of accountability. And then I think that Matthew discussed the notion that the IANA transition is not just ICANN, it's coordinating among everybody on that diagram on the board. But the second part of the transition, the ICANN accountability part, let me ask you, is that something that is determined by those who are participants within the little ICANN plasma sphere, or does that ICANN accountability involve everyone who's not even involved with ICANN?
It's an interesting question. I think part of it has to be answered by the fact that the accountability track now incorporates accountability issues related to the award of the contract for the IANA functions. And therefore, that is a global issue, and that has been a global concern. So I would certainly make the case that it's not just an internal ICANN issue, the accountability track. It definitely does have to reach out to others, given the scope of its work, which is clearly what ICANN has laid out.
Any of the rest you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Sorry, did you? So I think they're two distinct processes. I think that the accountability for the removal of the U.S. government from its stewardship role, that really has to do more with the direct customers of the IANA functions. There's obviously a greater element so that the world has confidence that this model actually works. But because those customers, the IETF, the regional internet registries, the names which are actually within ICANN, because some of them are outside of ICANN, it is broader than ICANN. But accountability, I think we're going to have enough of a challenge defining accountability for ICANN, and what does accountability within ICANN mean before expanding it to other junctures. And either we get it right and ICANN has credibility, beyond the ICANN community, or ICANN doesn't get it right, and the rest of the world goes somewhere else.
Becky?
I agree with Jamie in the following sense. I expect that all of the direct customers of the IANA and the larger community that are serving on the coordination committee and on the cross-constituency working groups and all of those things are really going to want to look at service levels, how service levels are set, how they're enforced, what happens. And so I expect that kind of accountability will be addressed by the IANA transition. And I think, the other track will have quite enough to do on that. Now, not everybody in the world who's affected by ICANN participates. So It's not to say that this is closed. Also, I expect that there are probably some kinds of expertise that we could benefit from that are not represented by ICANN participants. So I don't see it as a closed group, but I do think that they're two separate tracks.
If in the diagram, the affirmation and the IANA authority lines get moved around to some other places in the surrounding community, they're going to want to participate in the discussion of new ICANN accountability mechanisms. I take your point, Jamie. It's much better to sort of get it right with those who are part of the ICANN community, but we never want to be exclusionary. If somebody decides they want to get engaged, we say, come to every ICANN meeting, try to, join the working groups, because there's a place for everybody there.
Yeah, sorry. What I meant
Yep.
by that was not at all that it would be exclusionary. We want more participation, not less. What I meant was that we wouldn't start doing accountability for things outside of the ICANN remit.
Amen to that. Let's go to the second question. The IANA contract transition and the accountability track, while they are separate tracks, is there a risk they will create separate and conflicting accountability and redress mechanisms? This may be an easy question, but we'll start with you, Fiona.
So I think this is relatively straightforward. I don't see how that could happen. I think to Becky's point that she was just making, the coordination committee and the development of the IANA transition proposal will be dealing with accountability in and of itself, but I'd say accountability with a small a.
Yeah.
It's accountability to the customers of the services, and they're going to be focused on that. Whereas the other accountability work stream will be looking at the broader issues that Becky was raising, redress, maybe things like board selection, that kind of stuff. So I don't. While they're related, I think topically they would sort of be discrete enough that they wouldn't overlap. But remains to be seen once the groups get going.
Yeah, I agree with Fiona. I think it's unlikely, and if it does happen, there's going to be visibility to both, and I have confidence in the multi-stakeholder community to resolve those conflicts before they become a problem.
Anything on that, Matthew or Becky?
Yeah, I think I would have to agree that I think we have to wait and see what the working group and the coordinating group come up with. But it is important that they proceed in parallel, or at least with a significant amount of coordination in terms of what they're addressing. Because the more you start to unpack this in the two tracks, the more we may see that there are issues where there will have to be coordination, or there may be issues they'll have to address in common. I think we have to see how that process unfolds.
I agree.
Right. Yeah, and if the process starts to unfold that the IANA coordination team is getting input from its customers that call for strict accountability and redress mechanisms for things that are within the ICANN remit, but they have nothing to do with, well, the root protocols and numbers, then there would be obviously a need for us to try to say, hey, that really belongs in the other track, and take it on board as input, that other track, to avoid having conflicting mechanisms. That may be a challenge ahead. Third question, it's to whom in this big constellation in front of us should ICANN be accountable? And some have said, well, ICANN is going to be accountable to the world, and that's all that you really need. It's accountable to the whole world who uses the internet. What's your thought on whether that works? And fold this in as well. Is the Government Advisory Committee role, the GAC role, as it's shown on the diagram, is that sufficient to give governments what they need to impose accountability upon ICANN? Or do we believe in the year ahead they're going to be looking for something substantially more? Becky?
So this is the first of many mistakes that I'm going to cop to. I think that we made a mistake by creating the government advisory community as an outpost and not a stakeholder. And I wasn't at Net Mundial, but the notion that there were lines and there was a government line and there was, a civil society line seems to me to be much more appropriate and much more effective, because the problem from my perspective that we've had with the GAC is that they have had no skin in the game on the policies that get developed. They're sort of outside it. They comment in, but they come in afterwards. We need to bring them as a stakeholder, as an equal, stakeholder into the process, get them to have some skin in the game, get them to and then we need to give ICANN the tools it needs to say no when it should say no. But I actually hope that we use this as an opportunity to bring the GAC into the process in a much more informed participatory way. It may be that the level of attendees at the GAC has to change for a while or forever in order to do that. But I really do hope that we have a different relationship and we don't keep the GAC as a separate thing that sits up there and shoots at us.
Yeah, I have a bit of a difficulty with being accountable to the world. I mean, I think that what we should be looking for here is accountability to the communities and constituencies within ICANN. And insofar as ICANN is open and representative, then those individuals or organizations from around the globe who wish to participate can do so. So that, for me, is the accountability that we should be looking for. I completely agree with Becky in terms of the GAC. I think one of the most important things, and I think this comes back to concepts that you've talked about, Steve, is this kind of stress test and scenarios going forward. One of the things that we really do need to watch for is a differing weighting of the different communities and constituencies within ICANN going forward. If we have a GAC that seeks additional powers or additional weighting, that starts to shift out of a multi-stakeholder model and into something else. And I think that's something we really need to watch for.
So I'm not gonna touch the accountability questions because that's really for the enhancing ICANN accountability working group to and the community to decide. But on the GAC, I agree with Becky that the GAC really does need to be a stakeholder. I would point out that in the recent, in both actually, accountability and transparency reviews, there were recommendations about getting the GAC involved more early in the policy development process. And I think that's a great way of getting at what Becky was suggesting. And I think my sense is that they're actually making some good progress on figuring out how to implement that. It's really important that the GAC have a concrete role and a credible role within ICANN's multi-stakeholder system. I think a lot of ICANN's credibility goes to the effectiveness and credibility of the GAC itself. So one of the things that is being talked about now is whether or not the GAC should continue to have an advisory role to the board and be a liaison to the board, or should instead have a voting role. And I think you're hearing some of that discussion now in discussions about ICANN accountability. My own personal view is that they have more power as an advisory role. You know, they come with moral suasion. They come with whereas if they get a vote, they become one of, I think, 16 votes, and they will lose. You know, and what happens when they lose? You know, and that doesn't bode well for them either. Whereas right now, under the bylaws, the board must consider GAC advice, must consult with the GAC before rejecting GAC advice. And I think that's a powerful undergirding of the multi-stakeholder model that is ICANN.
Fiona?
So maybe I'll answer this slightly differently. I think the question to whom should ICANN be accountable makes it seem like ICANN is a monolithic organization and it's just one thing. So there's ICANN the board, there's ICANN the staff and CEO, there's ICANN the community, there's ICANN the stakeholders. So I think depending on which ICANN you're talking about, accountability could be different, and I don't think anyone's mentioned that. So, but I think maybe Matthew did to the larger extent that ultimately you've got to be accountable and responsive to the participants and the stakeholders in the community that you serve. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Also, I think the chart that you have up here makes it look like everyone around the yellow box, they're actually all inside the yellow circle as well. Almost all of them are, if not all. So, I mean, they're all ICANN as well. So I think it's important when we talk about ICANN, we sort of differentiate what we're talking about and not. On the role of governments within ICANN, I think to Becky's point and Jamie's as well, we've done a lot of changes in the recent years with the affirmation of commitments and the accountability review teams. And the first set of ATRT recommendations specific to the GAC really were about the GAC board relationship and trying to sort of put some clarity around that. And people have to keep in mind this is only 15 years old. This is the system, and a lot's been accomplished in 15 years. And we're sort of developing the rules as we go along, and there had to be I think, some written procedures around certain things. And the accountability and transparency review team, the second one, the board just adopted the recommendations and implementation plan in London. The GAC recommendations, you really get to GAC internal work methods and GAC openness and how the GAC interacts with the ICANN stakeholder community, to the point that Becky was getting at, which is how do you get the GAC much more involved in the policymaking process in the GNSO earlier rather than later? And again, I think there's a lot of great work that's happening in the ICANN world on those things, and we'd expect to see that continue.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit if I could. When I asked about accountability of the entity ICANN, the entity I meant, and I should have clarified, is the corporation. It's a public benefit corporation from California, and that includes its management, which makes decisions, and staff that implements things, and it includes its board, whose sworn duty is to the best interests of the corporation. That's what the bylaws say. So there's a corporation with a board that's trying to look out for the interests of the corporation, and then there's the community outside of it. And that is why I think it is appropriate, just in that context, Fiona, to show that that entity ICANN has outside interests in communities that surround it and expected certain deliverables from it.
So I'm going to push.
Fia?
Yeah, I'm going to push back just a little bit, because ICANN doesn't exist without its community, right? If there's no stakeholder community, there is no ICANN. And Mr. Crocker had his hand up. Maybe I don't know. He
But
wants to
Fiona,
comment.
if ICANN held a meeting and all the paid employees showed up and the board was flown in, nobody from the outside community would have to show up, and it would do business. So, I mean, the community is what really makes ICANN special. Believe me, I'm part of it. But it is an entity, a legal entity, and it has directors that are legally accountable to the entity. And you're looking over at your chairman because he's dying to
He's
get in on
anxious
this.
to say something, so I
Well-
will defer and let him.
Well,
respond.
when the chairman of ICANN is here, I'm happy to defer. Steve, if you want to get a microphone from the back. And so I wanted to clarify, while Steve's getting that, I did want to clarify, I meant the corporation, and much of the discussion on the accountability will be about management and the corporation.
So, but if ICANN, the corporation, is executing on policies developed by the community, if the community's not there, what are they going to do? I guess that was my question.
Steve Crocker?
Thank you. So I wanted to respond to the very specific words that you used, Steve, about the nature of ICANN as a corporation. Yes, indeed, ICANN is a corporation incorporated in the state of California and subject to the laws of California. Yes, indeed, the board has a responsibility in the usual way as a fiduciary responsibility for a thing. But the next piece that you focused on was that implied that the sole responsibility of the board is to the corporation per se, and that's simply not true. That's simply a misstatement and a mischaracterization that does an awful lot of harm, really, to the whole enterprise. ICANN is a very purposefully, and you know all this, very purposefully constructed to have a public purpose, which is all well documented. We have a hierarchy, if you like, sort of the Maslow's kind of idea of concerns. We have to be concerned about the financial health. We have to be concerned about whether we're obeying laws and so forth. But those are kind of basic. Over and above that, we have an inescapable obligation to serve the purpose for which we were created, which it means serving the internet community and the constituencies that were involved. And the way that you phrased it suggested that there is that there isn't that obligation built in. It is, and that is an absolutely core part. So we're not like an ordinary for-profit corporation whose implied purpose is to go make as much money as possible or to pass ourselves down to our children or whatever the usual purposes of a small corporation are. We have a very specific purpose. Many of us, certainly myself, would not be involved if we were just like, at least not for what they're paying us anyway, just an ordinary corporation. And I think that that's absolutely crucial. So I'm taking issue with not precisely with the words that you used, but with the implication that was very strongly pushed there. I've been trying to stay absolutely quiet through this meeting, but you nudged me here.
So
And Becky?
if I could put just perhaps to find a point on that, the board would not exist without the community.
And Becky?
So this is actually a fairly complex legal topic. A general corporation, Steve, has fiduciary obligation to the corporation and to the shareholders. And I think ICANN as a public corporation has that public purpose there too. So I think that the whole notion, we have heard from time to time that phrase, the fiduciary duty to the corporation, that as a legal matter usually exists in a bankruptcy or insolvency setting, but we have heard it from time to time, and I think Steve's right. It has been harmful because it can't actually be true.
And with request to the GAC's role, what we've observed too is that the governments in the GAC find it difficult to participate early with any degree of specificity at policymaking. They like to create general principles they can come to consensus about and lob them into the mix. And when asked, well, what did you mean by that? They like to say, read our principles. And then later on, what we did in the new GTLD program was we at ICANN gave the governments significant discretion to object to new top-level domains that were applied for really any reason at all that the governments would agree upon. There was significant deference given to them, and that's not in the ICANN constitution. That was in the new GTLD application guidebook. And I think that some of that might be changed in the next GTLD program. There might be more specificity required and a higher degree of consensus required before strings are brought down. But the GAC seems not to prefer getting involved early and in detail, but high level, and then they like to be a jury that might well rule on how something looks when it came through the process. It's a huge challenge to get them engaged more, but I firmly agree we need to.
I mean, they did demand 5 seats on the coordinating committee, right? I thought that was sort of, my view was give it to them and see if they show up.
Why not?
But let me just say, the rules for the new GTLDs did give the GAC this very big power. I think there's a serious question about whether that power could possibly be interpreted to permit ICANN to violate its bylaws in order to follow GAC advice.
Great. Let's move to the next question, which is, given that the IANA contract is the last bit of external accountability for ICANN, give us some specific suggestions for mechanisms or structures that would improve ICANN's accountability. And if you can, please give examples, maybe where your suggested mechanism would have made a difference on decisions and policies that were adopted in the past. Jamie, we agreed to let you go first because I wanted you to sort of recap the mechanisms that ICANN has already listed as an inventory for us to consider.
Sure. And one quibble with the question. It's the contract is not the last bit of external accountability. There's also the affirmation of commitments, which persists. But laying out, so I'm not going to do the rest of the question, but just to give a quick overview of the mechanisms that exist now. Of course, first there's the bylaws, which lay out our commitment to transparency, mission, and core values, and define ICANN's relationships with stakeholders. There's the affirmation of commitments signed in 2009 with the Department of Commerce. Among other things, it requires community-led reviews roughly every 3 years on accountability and transparency, security, stability, resiliency of the DNS, basically a new GTLD program, and who is policy. The next big grouping of accountability mechanisms are the redress mechanisms specified in the in the bylaws. There's the ombudsman, who reviews claims of unfairness by ICANN or its constituent entities. The reconsideration process, which allows for challenges of either staff actions taken against ICANN policies or board actions that may be taken without consideration of all material information or are based upon false or inaccurate information. And then finally, the independent review process, which allows for claims that the ICANN board acted in a manner that was inconsistent with its bylaws or articles of incorporation, to be considered by an independent panel, basically an arbitration panel of neutrals. There are external laws that we have to abide by, laws by the California laws, because that's where we are incorporated, as well as U.S. laws, in that we are a tax-exempt public benefit organization, so we have to act in the furtherance of our stated public purposes. So moving down the hierarchy, there are, but equally important really, are organizational reviews. There are reviews of each of the supporting organizations and advisory committees periodically, as well as the nominating committee, to make sure that they are performing and operating well. We make a lot of information available. This goes as much to transparency as it does to accountability. We regularly prepare, publish financial reports and statements, post information about current projects and operational activities. We have a FOIA type process under which people can request information that is not otherwise made public. The last thing I was mentioning before, there's the ICANN board selection process, under which the supporting organizations, nominating committee, and the ALAC have the opportunity to select the board members. And then finally, the board itself makes available a ton of information regarding their meetings, their minutes, materials that they use.
Thanks, Jamie. So that inventory was assembled by staff and it was presented to the community as we consider how to follow the enhanced accountability track. Implication being we might add some, or we might change and improve some that are in the inventory. But it'd be great to hear from our panelists about specific things that you think are gonna be needed, either within that inventory or outside of that inventory. Becky, why don't you start us?
So it's not for lack of processes that ICANN is that every constituency stood up at the microphone and called on ICANN to improve its accountability. It's the fact that the processes don't work very well and need to be fixed. I think that there is we're talking about ICANN as a part of internet governance, and I am the first person to say this is not internet governance writ large. This is governance over this slice. But any governance scholar or expert you talk to, the world agrees that you need an executive branch, you need a legislative branch, and you need an independent judiciary, a truly independent judiciary. And ICANN doesn't have a truly independent judiciary in a meaningful way. And I actually think, although the independent review, first of all, the standard has been changed because there were some perhaps abuses of the independent review, but it wasn't changed in a way that actually addressed those, because you've got a new one. So first of all, we have to have a standard. What is the standard that the independent judiciary would apply? And I would posit that that is a compact. That's outside of the bylaws, but a compact that requires something different, something special, more community involvement, more ratification, for example, for the board to change that. And I say that specifically because we have seen the board change the bylaws in ways that that have not promoted accountability. Second, I think that the existing bylaws have a lot in terms of the mission statement and core values, have a lot to begin with as part of that compact, but I think that's critical. The second thing I think is that we've seen through all of the independent reviews that there is quite a huge variety of competence and familiarity with the way ICANN works and an ability to get your arms around it. It's a complicated thing. So we have decisions that are all over the place. in in the new GTLD process. My view would be that we have to have, and the accountability experts who worked after the first ATRT recommended a standing panel of judges, of independent judges, who can build precedent and who can provide information and guidance about how the board should act proactively, not just settling disputes that exist, but providing guidance for how the board should act going forward. And finally, I think that this is really a critical piece of having the GAC come into the community as a stakeholder, which is right now, the board really is shoved between a rock and a hard place. If the GAC wants to insist forever that you can't delegate wine and van, it's hard. It's hard for the board to say no. We've seen that. I know that it's not impossible, but it would be really nice if before we got to this point, there could be an authoritative determination about what the rules said about that apply to this application and what is required by the ICANN bylaws or the compact with respect to this. And I think we would just not be in the problem that we're in if we had that.
Well, very specific, and I appreciate that. Matthew.
Yes. So I'm just going to come back to this list of accountability efforts that Jamie just noted. I think one of the concerns that we have, and it's been expressed by other stakeholders, is that many of those accountability and review mechanisms actually sit within the affirmation of commitments, and that is a process that can be stepped away from with 120 days notice. So it seems to me that somehow the value, clearly these commitments within the AOC have incredible value. And there should be perhaps a way of incorporating those into the bylaws so that we don't lose those review and transparency and accountability mechanisms going forward should things change within ICANN. And I think that's probably a kind of almost a minimal thing that we should be expecting. I like Becky's ideas as well.
Matthew, let me ask you this. One other thing about the affirmation, this really tees it up for Fiona, the key author of the affirmation, is that it's a bilateral agreement. It's between one government and ICANN, the corporate entity. And that, given that, it is likely to become the next target for those who claim that the U.S. shouldn't have a unique role. So it makes sense to find some way to transform the best elements of the affirmation and makes them non-cancelable. And so with that, Fiona, I'd love to hear your view on that.
I think maybe just start off by saying I think at the Department of Commerce and NTA, we're trying not to prejudge the work of the group, so I don't think we want to sort of get into too specifics. But just to share a couple of observations based on what folks have just said. The affirmation of commitments and the commitments that the department makes sort of are one part. There's three parts to the affirmation: the commitments ICANN makes, the commitments the department makes, and then the actual executionable part of the affirmation, which is the review teams. And my recollection of the ICANN commitments, most, if not all of those, are enshrined in their bylaws. So I think one of the things the accountability group needs to take a look at is there something they need to do to enshrine their review teams in some fashion that makes sense? That seems like an easy topic for folks to take up. I will just say on two other points, I think, to what Becky had spoke to, and this is in reference, and Secretary Strickling has made these points a couple of different times over the last couple of years, that our view has been that the role of the board is not to make decisions, right? The role of the board is just to confirm that the community has developed a consensus proposal. And if the community hasn't agreed, the board should be sending it back. And I think what we've seen over the years is that's not happened in some cases previously. I think the last 4 or 5 years, it's been more consistent. So there's got to be an assessment of that mechanism and what do you do when the community can't come to consensus. And then this idea that you would take the accountability problems that exist in the current structure that people are concerned about and create yet a new place to move them to is not something that we think is probably the most judicious thing to follow on. And Larry said that this morning in the opening session, and he feels he said that in London as well. So the idea of creating yet another group to shift the problem to without actually addressing the problem is not one I think we've sort of thought should take the most energy. But again, it really is up to the group to get together and talk it through.
So I just want to say, when I talk about an independent judiciary, I'm not talking about an external
Yes, I know.
judiciary.
I know.
I'm talking about and So
know.
to the extent it doesn't work, I mean, it's how does the US judicial system work?
Yeah, I understand, but I'm just telling you what our view has been and where we've been on that. So.
And one of the things we studied, Fiona, was at the business constituency was how much of the affirmation is already in the bylaws. And the affirmation's got 9 paragraphs, 9 sections to it. And you talked about section 9 where the reviews are. And for sure, they're not in the bylaws. But in addition, paragraphs 3, 4, 7, and 8 are not in the ICANN bylaws. So there's lots more in the affirmation that we should explicitly bring over to the bylaws. And as Matthew indicated, that eliminates it being just a bilateral agreement. We have one final group question, and then so I want you to start teeing up the questions that you've got, and we'll have a roving mic going around the room. So the last question for the panel, we'll start with you, Fiona. In the interest of being accountable to stakeholders, should ICANN carefully constrain itself to just the domain name system, or should it expand its scope to address other emerging issues?
So I think in sort of, it's really up to sort of the stakeholder community to discuss the remit of the institution. And as a stakeholder in the process from the U.S. government, I think we would like ICANN to sort of stay focused on the domain name system. That's what stakeholders created it for, as Becky pointed out, and that's what its task and mandate is. So I think we would be reluctant to see sort of an expansion of that scope.
I know of no desire internally to expand the scope beyond the coordination of unique identifiers.
I can only echo what we've heard. Very clear, limited mandate would be ideal.
+1.
So the extent to which ICANN gets asked to help, the answer may have to be, well, not just no, but we're not the ones, but here's where to go for help. And if somebody wanted help at modeling a multi-stakeholder process, God knows why they'd model it on ours at ICANN, but we could provide that. But I'm glad to see unison about that. That's really fantastic. Great answers so far. So we have plenty of time, almost 25 minutes for audience Q&A. So there's a few hands up. I'll start over here, Carl. And please give your name and affiliation.
Sure. Yeah, sure. My name's Carl Schoenander. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association. Good afternoon. So I think Mr. Crocker alluded to, and also Jamie alluded to the fact that ICANN is incorporated in the state of California. State of California law applies, U.S. law applies. I'd like the panel's view on how important that is for ICANN accountability and whether that should remain the case. Just as a general comment, I think, from the business community's perspective, I think that's been an important element in the success of ICANN. We can all think of examples of non-accountability situations that we'd like to avoid. I'm thinking of an Economist editorial 3 weeks ago about FIFA, which is incorporated in Switzerland, and I think we want to avoid that issue. So I'd like your perspective on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. So the question is a perspective on, in this accountability enhancements, tackling the question of should it remain a California corporation, and if it doesn't, how do we manage those risks? Who wants to try that? Becky.
So
Why did you put it there to begin with?
Joe did. Or John did, I don't know. John was in LA, that's why. So it was incorporated in California. Yes. Okay. Anyway, I think that the question is sort of predictability, commercial predictability, and and the ability for commercial actors to understand what the law is. Now, there are a lot of U.S.-based commercial actors in this. To me, I know that this is there's a solution other than being incorporated in Switzerland. ICANN could negotiate applicable law in contracts. So if the European registrars all wanted German law to apply it, ICANN could negotiate that. Now, I know that ICANN's lawyers will tell you that's a very bad idea, but I think that that the question should really not be about. It should really focus on what's going to make the world predictable for the people who are affected by it. That means, the contracted parties. It means intellectual property owners who have to deal with it. It means a whole bunch of things, and that's what we should be focusing on.
Matthew?
Yeah, it's definitely a component of accountability, but I completely agree with Becky. We're already biting off quite a lot right now between the accountability, strengthening of ICANN's accountability, and also the IANA transition. I think in the interest of predictability, certainly from a commercial perspective, it's important to just work our way through what we're doing at the moment and leave that for another time if it is something that needs to be addressed at another time.
So just briefly, ICANN has no plans to move to Switzerland. We have 3 operational hubs around the world in Los Angeles, Singapore, and Istanbul. The bulk of the work is done still in LA. That is where all the contracting is done. That is where the IANA functions are housed. We have recently opened an office in Geneva. It is an engagement office. It is one of the half dozen or so other engagement offices we have around the world, like the one here in Washington.
Thanks, Jamie. I'll jump to this side of the room, and then I'll go back and back around the front. Front row, Mr. Corwin.
Thank you, Steve. Phil Corwin, and just 2 minor points I'd like to make, and then 1 big point. On minor points, just commenting on the discussion on the board and on ICANN's public policy role. Yes, it's there, but at least within the community, there's a perception that sometimes more mechanistic than subjective means are chosen to make decisions in implementing things in order to avoid litigation risk. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that that's out there. On an expanded role for the GAC, my one qualm about that would be that we've seen the GAC try to have ICANN adopt policies for which there's no universal law, and that would turn ICANN into a more parliamentary legislative body, which is its role is to enforce existing rights, but not to create new rights. The main point I'd like to make is that something rather remarkable happened at the London meeting, which is that for the first time ever, all the constituencies within the GNSO agreed on something. And what they agreed on, and they read a statement in public, was that they agreed on the creation of an independent accountability mechanism and structure as part of the IANA transition. So I would key off that and say that for everyone who wants to support the multi-stakeholder model, I think the best way to do that is to support this unanimous view of the stakeholders and make sure that the enhanced accountability mechanism, whatever it turns out to be, and that's yet to be seen, does proceed in tandem with the transition and that they move together. And I'd welcome any comment on that. Thank you.
So Phil made 3 statements. I'd love to get the reaction of the panel. 1 is ICANN makes mechanistic decisions sometimes to avoid litigation. 2, the GAC sometimes asks ICANN to create new rights, and the GNSO agreed that enhanced accountability ought to precede the IANA transition. Fiona?
So maybe take them in reverse order. I think, there's a clear understanding that you're going to have to do both processes in parallel, and there's going to have to be some completion before you can actually execute the transition. I think that's widely agreed and accepted in some fashion. The groups have got to get going, and the work's got to happen, and we'll sort of see how that unfolds. In terms of the GAC, I think what Phil said was an expanded role for the GAC, and that's not what we were talking about here. It was actually integrating GAC more into the process. I don't think at least from our perspective, we'd be looking for an expanded role for the GAC. It's actually getting them more integrated into the process. And then with respect to the board and how the board acts, mechanistic or not in terms of policy implementation, I would just sort of put it back on the GNSO a little bit, which is you have the ability within how you develop a PDP, and for those not involved in ICANN, it's the policy development process, to set the terms of that. So you could in your PDP process deal with implementation issues as well. So I know we've talked about this a little bit before in terms of ATRT too, and this gets a little bit in the weeds on ICANN, but I think there's a little bit more power you have in your own space to deal with some of these issues as well.
Thank you, Fiona. Jamie?
Sure. Just on the GAC point, was not talking about, nor was the community talking about expanding the role of the GAC when it adopted the ATRT recommendations about having the GAC and more engaged, more in earlier and more often in the policy development process.
Yeah, there's plenty of reasons to get upset at the GAC from time to time, but the fact that they used what we gave them in the guidebook, let them object for any reason they want. So we got what we created in that case, and it doesn't necessarily create new rights.
Correct. On the other hand, the GAC can provide advice on anything at any time. So
And Steve, just to jump back in, the reason I had made that comment was because Becky said she thought it was a mistake at the beginning to make them merely advisory. I'm absolutely in favor of creating processes for better integrating the GAC into the policy making process from the start. The GNSO is working on that, and in fact, they just put out a call for a liaison from the GNSO to the GAC to help facilitate that. So I have no problem with that. I just don't want to see governments pushing ICANN toward making policies that aren't international for principles that aren't internationally recognized.
So I did say that I thought the way we set it up at the beginning was a mistake, and that is because we made them external and not part of the, not sufficiently part of the process. I don't think that what I'm talking about expands their power. It does expand their responsibility to be part of the community. But I actually think that we need them in the process. And if we don't have them in the process, they're going to keep doing what they're doing now, which is not effective for anybody.
Becky, could you clarify? You said external, but they're an advisory committee. There's also the ALAC, the At-Large Advisory Committee, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. There are several advisory committees, but what makes the Government Advisory Committee more external than the rest of those?
Because they have a separate mechanism with, a bylaw created mechanism to reach in, provide advice that has to be, that has to be listened to in different ways. All of that actually could be managed. I'm not saying that that's necessarily going away, but it is essentially a group that has been from the very beginning. Just physically, and I'm going to take ownership for this. It's physically been in a room. It's always in the room that's farthest away from everybody. It's now open most of the time, which is great, but there's no interaction. We have cross constituents. We meet across constituents. We stand up in the forum. At the beginning, the governments used to stand up in the public forum. That almost never happens now. I know Marilyn's going to disagree with me, but I don't know why.
Anyone else on Phil's question?
I don't know if
Matthew.
you want to disrupt.
No,
the
no,
flow
you,
here. Okay.
please, you go ahead.
So,
We'll
so
take another
just
question.
just on Phil's last point on the independent accountability mechanism, I think that whether we agree or disagree that these two processes are interdependent, interrelated, should run in parallel or whatever, what we do have to be careful is that we have in place an accountability framework for ICANN before we move too far down the road on the transition side, or at least in terms of them running in parallel, that accountability framework, however it's designed, needs to be in place. And I think that's essential. That's not to say that one stops the other from moving forward, but we have to ensure that that type of framework is in place.
That's great. All right, we're going to go to the back on the left side. We'll take former ICANN Chairman Peter Dengate Thrush.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to begin by endorsing completely everything Steve Crocker said in relation to the nature of ICANN. Everybody goes to work at ICANN or for ICANN with ICANN because they want to build a global body that's trusted by the global community to handle these resources. Nobody goes because they think it's a California not-for-profit. I'd like to relieve Becky, actually, of some of the burden of guilt she's obviously feeling in relation to the GAC, because I think she got it right to start with, and that your current thoughts are wrong. And in fact, you need to understand many, many different cultural perspectives to get this right. I think the role of the GAC and ICANN is one of its extraordinary successes. It's certainly been the key to its success for the first 15 years. What you've got to understand is the extraordinary power of governments, and particularly with a small ICANN, which could have been knocked over by a lawsuit from VeriSign. One company like VeriSign is still incredibly weak by comparison with the power of a government. Governments have armies, they pass laws, they arrest people, and in fact, in some countries, they execute people. You have to treat governments and their powers with extreme caution. And as part of that, you need to understand the cultural approach that many people, probably not in this room, and certainly not with the kind of session we had earlier where we had government representatives on the stage and being challenged. That does not happen in many, many countries. It doesn't probably happen in most countries. And when you want to have a policy debate and there is a government official in the room, guess what happens? Nobody says anything. That government official explains what's going to happen. Everybody nods and you go away again. So keeping government officials out of the policy development process for most of the world until the end when they could come in is not the best approach to policy development, but it was the only way that you can get a policy development process that actually has supported and endorsed and allowed to flourish the multi-stakeholder approach. So I would say congratulations, Becky, for creating a structure that brings the GAC in, allows them to participate, but keeps them out of the discussion until later. Now, it's not perfect, and we see the circumstances where the GAC comes in late, but that, I assure you, is better than having them in at the beginning and squashing by their mere presence what would have been a proper policy debate. Now, things have changed. ICANN is stronger, it's more robust, and it is time to examine the role of the GAC, but don't feel bad about the way it's developed. And
Any
by all
reaction?
means, bring them in a way, but recognize the extraordinary imbalance of power. And what ICANN has done quite well is create a forum where those imbalances are best addressed.
That's right. Thank you, Peter. Becky?
I'm not losing any sleep over the fact, over the notion of the GAC running in and participating in the policy development policy development process in an integral way anytime soon. So I take your meaning, but we do have to get them involved earlier and more meaningfully rather than having them sit outside and come after. If you were the applicant for wine or van, you would feel very differently than you do now. I mean, I understand that governments are powerful, but I think that if they understand the issues and we lay the hard questions on the table, earlier on, we can make decisions that will be better.
Okay, Steve, can I move to a second point? Or do you want?
Actually, no, that was a long one. Let's give the rest of the panel a chance to react, and I think we'll move to somebody else after that. Fiona.
So I was just going to actually agree with Peter. I think this is obviously the U.S. IGF. We're having a very U.S. conversation, but you have to put in perspective that ICANN is not U.S. only; it's global, and it's really important that the structures and processes work for other cultural norms and values. And to Peter's point, I think that's actually a really great point for people in this room to keep in mind.
That's great. So when IGF USA reports out on Istanbul, we'll say, we wanted to welcome the governments, but this guy from New Zealand told us to keep you out of the room. No, just kidding. Thank you very much for that, Peter. We'll go to this corner of the room. Anybody in the back? Gentleman in the back with his hand up. And then we'll come.
Hi, Rick Lane. First of all, I agree with Steve that the folks who are involved in ICANN now are trying to do the right thing. But when we're looking at internet accountability, we're not looking at, and we shouldn't make this an us versus them. This is about what ICANN is going to look like in the future of future boards and future protections. You know, we always have this argument in DC with the Federal Trade Commission, because the current Federal Trade Commission may be great. You want to give them authority to do the right thing. But as a business community, we're always like, well, once they have the authority, what can they do later on when you don't have a good chairman or a good Federal Trade Commission in place? So I think we need to disassociate ourselves with the current thought and who's in place now, but what do we want ICANN to look like in the future? And we did that back in 98 and 99 when we were having these discussions. You know, we didn't know exactly what we wanted, but we knew that it was better than it being at the ITU at that point. And so I think as we have these discussions, and Heritage Foundation has put out a paper with some specific recommendations on what to look at in terms of ICANN accountability. There's others that are going to be out there. But again, I think we need to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to go? Because there's a lot of great things that are in place in ICANN now. We need to take those, but we can always improve. We're not going to be perfect, but we need to make this not about today, but what we want ICANN to look like tomorrow and what type of accountability mechanisms we want to have in for tomorrow to ensure that ICANN stays the course.
Great. Panelists, any reaction to that notion of disassociating from the present company, notwithstanding, in terms of designing our accountability mechanism? Fiona?
Yeah, I think Rick makes a great point, and I think Steve, you sort of brought this idea up. I don't remember when, maybe Singapore, the idea of stress tests. It's come up a couple of times, but identifying, what are the things you really want to test to make sure you have the right processes in place. And one of the things that people need to take a look at is in the decision-making structures at ICANN, where is our ability to have capture and how to make sure you prevent capture, whether it's at the board or different levels of the institution. And again, these are things that I would expect this accountability work stream to take up when it gets going.
Great. Matthew?
Yeah, I absolutely, to build on the gentleman in the back. I'm sorry, I don't know you, but happy to meet you afterwards. The key issue here is is how do we get it right for the next 10 years, the next 15 years, the next 20 years? What do we do now that's responsible so that it puts ICANN in good stead moving forward, so that it can be and continue to be a fantastic multi-stakeholder model that we can look to, that we should, when it's strengthened, its processes and other things, that we should cherish. It's one of very few that we have to look to. So it's incredibly important that we get this right.
Thank you, Matthew. We're going to take one question from our Twitter followers.
Yes, our Twitter follower, Robin Gross, asked what specific fixes are needed to existing ICANN accountability mechanisms before the transition.
That was question 4 that we already put to the panel. So Robin may have not heard
Sure.
it or joined us a little bit late. So I think we've covered that one already. So this part of the room, front half, Evan had his hand up first. Evan, please.
Hi, my name is Evan Leibovich. I'm vice chair of the entity that shall not be named on the chart. Externally, yes. I wanted to pick up on something, Matthew, that you said earlier, when you said that you questioned the concept of ICANN's accountability to the world. And I would like to get the rest of the panel to flesh that out, because I've been spending at least my time within ICANN trying to bring the world in at the point of the end user. It's in the bylaws of ICANN that there's a place for the end user at the table. And if you're coming back and saying that ICANN isn't accountable to the world, I would like you to flesh that out, because I want to make sure that I know what you say by that, because there's an awful lot of people that are involved in the process right now that don't want to be told that they're wasting their time.
Yeah, and I'll first react that Evan's with an at-large advisory committee, so it's at-large. Internet users at large, and that could be users or registrants who don't consider themselves fitting in within any of the given constituencies that are structured. And so at large isn't on the chart because there are users in every single one of those sections of the chart. And when the user is a customer of eBay, the business constituency eBay considers themselves looking out for those customers. We've heard governments claim that they alone represent the interests of users who are the citizens of their countries. And none of that really holds water. If somebody wants to be an unaffiliated at-large, they ought to have a place at the table, and they do. So Matthew did want to react first to the question on accountability to the world.
Yeah, that's certainly not what I meant. What I meant was it's a very nebulous concept. And what I was trying to emphasize was the openness of ICANN to individuals coming and participating in ICANN as a part of opening itself to the world. That was my comment.
The only follow-up I'd have is that because of the nature of the way at-large works, it's a very deliberative process. A policy thing comes up, and it can take months to churn down to the grassroots to come back up. And so a process that takes months essentially gets about the same mental space as somebody standing up at the public forum for 30 seconds. And so some people think of that as being a problem in terms of the relative visibility.
Thank you, Evan. We have time for 2 questions if they're quick, or 1 if it's long. John Curran had his hand up a while ago.
I have just two very quick questions of clarification I've been trying to get in. Fiona, one for Fiona and one for Jamie. Fiona, you said when they were talking about the scope of ICANN and whether or not its remit should become larger, you said it should remain should be the DNS system. And I guess I just need to know, did you mean the DNS being the DNS? Or do you mean the DNS being how NTIA uses the DNS system phrase occasionally to also refer to protocol parameters and IP addresses all as DNS system? Because if you just say DNS, that's a narrower remit than some of what ICANN's doing. Jamie, I have a similar simple question of clarification. You had a very exhausted list of mechanisms for accountability, including contractual and bylaws and mechanisms, but you omitted the MOU between ICANN and the IETF, the MOU, which is RFC 2860, which provides ICANN to perform the IANA functions. Is that because that's no longer operative, or is that just an omission, or what?
Yeah, I left off. So you're absolutely right, and I apologize for leaving off that and other contractual arrangements we have that really dictate a lot of the work that we do. So the MOU with the IETF is a very important one, and did not mean to diminish that.
Fiona, why don't you handle the DNS question?
Yeah, so I think there's always different people use different terms to mean different things. And when I say DNS, I refer to how it was defined in the green paper and the white paper, and how the department defines it, which includes ICANN's current remit. So I appreciate that the numbering, the numbering people think that DNS doesn't include them sometimes, but I think our view is that you can't have the domain name system without the names and the numbers and the other parts.
And the protocols as well?
Yes.
Okay. There, you got your answer, John. One final question. No hands over here. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question to Becky about at least a specific thing about Tom Leonard from the Technology Policy Institute. I'd like to ask a question of Becky about her proposal for judicial review and exactly how that would work. It's obviously an interesting proposal, and the two, obviously it's a proposal for judicial review subject to certain standards. So the two obvious questions are, one, who picks the judges, and two, how do the standards get developed?
Yeah. So the standards. I mean, I think one of the things that the accountability process is going to talk about is what are those standards. I do think that there's very important stuff in the bylaws and affirmation of commitments that help guide that. In terms of the experts after ATRT 1 did recommend creation of a standing panel of jurists. So it's not like this is a completely new idea. My view would be we probably need to have someone, a number of people who are available, and then somebody, a chief judge who's more or less full-time, whatever, but then the panels get constituted. We obviously have to worry about what protections get put in place to avoid nuisance kinds of suits. At the same time, we want to make sure that we get at the problems earlier in the process, so they're not multi-billion-dollar problems as opposed to smaller problems. And I think that, there are a wonderful number of very senior, well-respected international jurists, some of whom have demonstrated real understanding of the ICANN process through these arbitration panels. And I think that out there are a number of people who would be interested. This is if you're a retired judge, this is a great job.
Thank you. And that will conclude, because we have to finish this up at 4 o'clock. And I think it's been fantastic. The dialogue, questions, disagreements, and ideas that have surfaced demonstrate what will happen over the next year and a half that we design the new accountability mechanisms for ICANN. So I think you've seen a preview, fast forward preview on what that's all going to look like. Let me close by thanking the fantastic panel that we have here today, our panel coordinator, Christopher Hammerline of NTIA, and all of the IGF USA organizers. Thank you very much.